Hello everyone. In this class we will discuss about exception handling. But what exactly is exception? Exception is something you can call it as a special type of an error. We have already seen that there are various types of errors that can occur in a program. It may be a syntax error or it may be a logical error. And generally when we call it as a runtime error, we say that it's an exception. And we will see that inside an exception, we also have two types of categories. So what exactly is an exception? So whenever there is a normal flow of execution of a program and we are expecting to execute something, it's not a logical error, it's not a syntax error, but due to some input being entered unexpectedly wrong or some other access to an array out of the range of the limits of the array or some other reasons the program cannot proceed properly, that is that they generally are called as an exception. And generally the exceptions are because of the input being entered wrong or some other reasons which are beyond the control of the programmer has done the syntax properly, programmer has done the logic properly, but due to some other reasons, either the user or the system, the program does not execute properly. Primarily that happens once the program has compiled properly, it has started executing, and then such type of errors occur. These are called as exceptions. The word errors and exceptions are loosely defined till now. We will define it crisply in the definition of Java. Also, there are some exceptions which are called as caught exception and uncaught exception. So there are certain exceptions which are uncaught exceptions. We will also discuss them in detail. But generally, the caught exceptions are the one which the compiler does not even allow to proceed further. The compiler knows that this exception might occur and it just does not allow it to proceed any bit further. These are called as uncaught exceptions. Now, when can an uncaught exception occur? When can a caught exception occur? So let us see this diagram where we will see that there is a class. Class is named as test, and now in this class we are dividing b by that is the value 30 by 0. We know that anything divided by 0, if we are trying to store it in int, that will definitely cause something not easily programmed or easily understood by any computer, so that generally will not execute properly any bit further. So in such case the Java program will throw an exception. The exception is written here, that is divide by 0. But still we don't know that that exception may occur. It may be possible that the value of c is entered by the user in a different program, so that still the programmer has not done a very blunder or a very big mistake. The user might enter a variable which the programmer has no control of. In such a scenario, we need to work such a bit that okay, that exception occurred, but still we need to proceed further. So now we can write it in a try catch block. If we know that there can be an exception that can occur in a certain situation, we can write that particular statement inside a try block. And anything which is written inside the try block, whenever an exception occurs, that exception can be caught by a catch block. And within the catch block, we can say that what exception we want to catch. And if the exception is caught, what do we want to do further? And once the exception is caught properly, after the catch block, the program starts executing properly. Even though the statement inside the try block has not executed to the complete fullest extent as the programmer might have designed. Still, in the catch block, we have caught the exception. We have printed in front of the user and did something, whatever we want to do. And after that point of time, we can keep on exceeding further with our program. Here in this case, you can see that the exception was printed, and after that point of time, the program continued as and when it was expected. We can also write a finally block. Finally block is used primarily if you want to release certain resources or we want to close some connections. So even if the exception occurs, even if the exception does not occur, it is caught, uncaught, finally block is always executed. So even if the exception occurs, still the code written in the finally block is always executed. If the exception occurs, it is caught, still the finally block is executed. If the exception does not occur, still finally block is always executed. So if you want to release certain resources, no matter what, if you want to work such a way that you want to close certain connections, we have open network connections or database connections. Even in case of exceptions or no exceptions, caught or not caught, still the finally block, whatever the code is written, will always be executed. That's the use of finally block. In this diagram we can very easily see that there is the main there is a superclass that is called an object, whose whose child are almost all the classes in Java. There is a class throwable that extends object, and the throwable is extended by exception class and an error class. Now in the exception class we have certain other child classes: runtime exception, IO exception, SQL exception, and AW2 exception. Fortunately, somehow or other, all these exception, IO exception and its subclasses, SQL exception, AWT exception, and interrupted exception, all of these exception, if there is a possibility of them occurring, the compiler will definitely flag some message and does not allow the program to be compiled, saying that we have a possibility of such an exception. And these are called as checked exception. But certain other exception like runtime exception, where we may feel that there might be a possibility of division by zero, or there may be a possibility in which we are accessing some index in the array which is out of bound, or some other cases in which we are trying to convert the string to an integer, where the string is such a very large number cannot be converted to an integer. All these exceptions can occur, which are not checked, and the compiler allows the program to execute. If it occurs, there is an exception. So these runtime exceptions, compiler cannot do anything. These are unchecked exceptions. Even the errors, such as the RAM size overflowing, or some input output error, or some other errors like stack overflow error, all these exceptions, the compiler cannot do anything, or the JVM cannot do anything in that particular case. Still, that thing is allowed to execute, and they are also unchecked exceptions. So in next class we will discuss in detail further.